we started recording? Aha, yes we have. Okay everyone, welcome to this talk. It's fantastic to see so many of you. As Kate said, my name's Roger. I work as director of Norwich Research School, one of the two research schools based in Norfolk and Suffolk. I'll be introducing you to my counterpart Andy later on, as he's doing next week's session in this series. And also co-presenting with me, as you heard, Dr Niki Kaiser. Hopefully you can all see the slides which we're going to be using, and you can see Nikki and I have put our Twitter handles on there. You've also got the Twitter handle for the research school we work as, so that if you want to, you can follow any of those. The advantage of having co-presenters today is that if you want to, you can fire anything into chat as we're going along, and one of us can keep an eye on that while the other one is presenting. We've also set aside some time at the end for question and answer as well, as we've only got the hour. Let's make a start then. So hopefully you've come to the right session. We're talking about how does evidence-informed teaching translate to remote teaching. And if my slides will advance, there we go. Essentially, we're going to look at what the best bets are from the world of research evidence on effective remote teaching. And as we walk through those best bets, we're going to be signposting some useful resources from the EEF that potentially you could use in your work, in your school. And then at the end, we hope there'll be time to reflect on potential next steps for the following academic year, as it seems unfortunately quite likely that we may be doing a mixture of on-site and remote provision for at least some of next academic year, which brings challenges. So just a bit more about Nikki, Susie and I before we start. We're based at Notre Dame High School, which is near the bus station in Norwich, and it is designated as Norwich Research School. That's one of 32 schools across the country, shown on that map there, that act as hubs for the work of the Education Endowment Foundation, the EEF, and also the Institute for Effective Education, the IEE. And essentially our job is to provide, as you can see on the screen, school-led support for the use of evidence to improve teaching practice. So it's fantastic that we were able with Kate to get in touch with all of you and start that process really. Now, with regards remote teaching, I just want to qualify this. We are a school. We are learning like others. Our job is to help you signpost, but I hope during this session we won't come across as know-it-all smartasses who've got all the answers. One of the things about research evidence is that it's not a silver bullet. It provides helpful signposting, helpful challenge, helpful direction to take, but it does not give you cast iron solutions to all your problems. It is not a silver bullet, okay? Right, so let's just rewind a bit. Schools closed on March the 20th. When I wrote this slide, I thought, are you serious, March the 20th? Yes, it was quite a long time ago. It didn't take long after that for people with loud voices to start wading into how best to teach remotely. The gentleman on the screen is one of those voices. Now, I couldn't find his original provocation, but this is one from more recently where people are coming in and giving quite strong opinions on how best to do remote teaching, and in some cases challenging schools, particularly in the state sector, as to whether they're doing it right or not. At the same time, we see interesting reports from the Sutton Trust and NFER as well, organizations that are using what teachers are telling them to paint a picture suggesting that the percentage of students engaged with our remote teaching nationally on average is quite worryingly low, and rather depressingly predictably, the more deprived an area is, the less the engagement with remote learning is. So there's lots of opinion out there, and there's certainly an urgent priority to make our remote teaching as effective as possible. But we need to be able to cut through the noise and the opinions. You'll find lots of those on Twitter and elsewhere, and we need to have a reliable starting point. Unfortunately, the EEF, our partner, performed what's called a rapid evidence assessment. They didn't go out and conduct new research or new trials. That wouldn't have been possible or probably appropriate. What they did was they did a massive review of past studies into remote teaching. So I'll say this straight away, not necessarily for contexts that are identical to the pandemic, because we are in unprecedented times, but the most relevant as well as the most reliable studies where remote teaching has been used in previous circumstances. And they came up with these headlines. So these are our best bets, what the evidence points to most strongly when it comes to doing remote teaching effectively. The first is this: teaching quality is more important than how lessons are delivered. Okay, we'll explore that one in more depth shortly. The next is hardly surprising. Ensuring access to technology is key, and if we're not careful, we'll lock out some of our most vulnerable learners academically from all of our efforts. I remember speaking to a very valued colleague at Notre Dame when this all started, and we were talking about how to make our remote teaching more effective, and he said, "But who's going to see the fruits of my labor, Roger? It's no good if only 10% are doing the work, and the work's stunning." Absolutely fantastic challenge. This is quite nice. Peer interactions can help motivate students as well as improve learning outcomes. 4, we've got to basically scaffold and support students working independently, as that is largely what they are doing with remote teaching, not through choice. And then 5, reassuringly, if you're hearing about what other schools are doing and it's not the same as you, there could be really good reasons for that, okay? You know your pupils best, you know your context best. Try not to do the looking over your shoulder at what the other school is doing all the time, unless of course you've got another school you talk to which has a very similar demographic or context in terms of pupil intake and needs to you, in which case it can be quite useful. Now, there's a lot there, and we've only got 50 minutes as I've started rambling. I can see Nikki screwing a face up at me. So what Nikki and I have planned is that we're going to focus very much on points 1 and 4 today, okay? Andy Samways, my counterpart from Suffolk, and his colleague Mark Rowland will be much more focused on what we can do for disadvantaged pupils during the pandemic and indeed in a subsequent recovery phase, and so may well allude more to point 2 in a week's time, as well as broaden that, okay? Right, so sticking with me for the time being, we're going to look at that first statement that teaching quality is more important than how lessons are delivered. And if we dive beneath that headline into the multi-page evidence review, which you can see in front of you, which is free to download from the EEF website, and I recommend reading it if you can find the time. This is the more paragraph of information about that first statement. So what's quite reassuring, if you've just done a year of training, is it's saying that good quality explanations, scaffolding work, and giving feedback to students is more important than whether we are teaching live stream sessions, or whether we're pre-recording sessions or delivering sessions through a remote learning platform or tool, okay? So just to emphasize this, what matters most, according to the evidence, is that the explanations are high quality, and by that we don't just mean we're clear, but they build on pupils' prior knowledge, and that we subsequently assess pupils' understanding of the new information we've imparted, okay? Now, this isn't exactly new. So the EEF came out with this rapid evidence review earlier this year in response to school closures, but it's not new, right? Because it's not based on brand new evidence. It's a sift of the evidence that was already out there. I don't know if you've read Kirshner and Hendrick's book, What Does This Look Like in the Classroom?, which was the first collaboration they did, an absolutely fantastic summary of bits of evidence and how we can apply them to the classroom. But more recently, they've written this book, How Learning Happens, another fascinating read. I was reading it about a month and a half ago, Nikki and I are going to trade books. She wants it as well. And actually, they refer to one of the seminal works in educational psychology as being from 1983 by a researcher called Clark, who wrote a paper reconsidering research on learning from media. And this was in response to discussions that still go on now, but were going on back then, along the lines of, well, technology means that we won't need a person in the room with the kids. We can it can all be automated. They can learn off whiz-bangy interactive videos and animations and all sorts. And what he said then, when he reviewed the evidence, still appears to stand today. The quote on the board, I rather like the quote that's on the screen right now, the board, force of habit, that the mechanism, the media, the technology we use is merely the delivery vehicle. Okay, that stands. And Kirshner and Sweller summarize this with the phrase, the medium is not the message. Kirshner and Sweller Kirshner, not Schweller, Kirshner and Hendrick go on to summarize that seminal piece of work as follows. No one medium, so technology platform, Zoom versus Teams versus Google Hangouts, etc., 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 is intrinsically better than any other. It's the quality of instruction we provide that makes the difference. We've got to be really careful, particularly now, avoiding falling prey to hype around certain platforms. For example, the calls for live delivery. This isn't really specific to technology use, but engagement is not the same as learning. We've got to be really careful with remote teaching that we don't just stop in terms of our assessment of how pupils are getting on by saying, oh, well, they did the work. Oh, well, they watched that video, etc. This is, I think, always relevant. I'm sure you've heard a lot about it from Kate and her team. If you're going to use slides or anything else, it's perhaps even more relevant when remote teaching to bear in mind what cognitive load theory says about extraneous load and what dual coding says about a coherent mix of audio and visual, as opposed to audio and visual that clash and overload students. We've got to be so careful. And if anything, we need to chunk content even more carefully through remote delivery than we do when we're in the classroom with students, when we can see when we've overloaded them because they grimace, they fidget, etc., etc. A bit more on the medium not being the message. If you are interested in exploring a bit more about this, I would signpost a couple of EEF guidance reports. Now, the first one is probably one of the least accessed on the EEF website because it sounds dull. It's about the use of digital technology in the classroom. But what's really interesting is the headline recommendations from this point in exactly the same sort of direction. So the first one is, don't just slap on some new technology before you've thought carefully about how will it improve your teaching and pupils' learning. If you cannot see the pedagogy, the rationale for the pedagogy that's linked to that technology, be cautious. Okay, potentially you're getting hypnotized by flashy technology. Okay, you don't want the technology to undermine your good teaching or be a barrier to your good teaching being transmitted to students. On the positive side, this guidance report talks about how technology can improve the quality of our explanations and modeling. For example, a good quality animation if used well, or a video that can be rewound and played again in a way that it can't be live in class all the time if you're the one talking. Another recommendation talks from this guidance report says that technology offers ways to improve the impact of pupil practice. So certain platforms like Seneca, where the learning and the tasks assigned to students are adapted based on an algorithm of what they get right, what they get wrong, provide students with intelligent practice that evolves. This is potentially something to take advantage of right now, and it's sat there waiting to be used. And then technology can play a role in improving the quality of assessment and feedback. So stating the obvious, technology can assess faster than we can and potentially more consistently than we can. Technology doesn't have a glass of wine and get a bit lazier about assessing essays as the evening gets longer. Stuff like comparative judgment is still useful right now. Auto-marking quizzes will mean that you don't have to mark the work in some cases, and may even throw feedback straight back at students without you having to do something. And if you've already got platforms like that, for goodness sake, intelligently use them. Don't reinvent the wheel. All right, I need to hurry up because otherwise I'm going to steal the important bit, which is Nikki. I just wanted to provide you with a bit of a case study about how our school has been trying to support the staff with remote teaching. So like many schools, we have what's called a teaching and learning model, which is basically categories or areas of pedagogy that evidence and professional experience tells us are really important. So down the left there, nothing surprising: questioning, challenge, literacy. You're going to see that in most schools, right? If they've bothered to write a teaching and learning model. And like many schools, ours is quite informed by cognitive science now. So if you look at the what is it in brief column, you'll see a lot of stuff from things like Rosenshine and cognitive load theory. Again, this isn't going to be unique to Notre Dame. But what we've done, which you might find interesting, is we've asked teachers to prioritize what they do through remote teaching. So we've adapted our teaching and learning model for remote teaching and provided lots of guidance for staff. We're encouraging our staff to reuse videos that are already out there and resources that are already out there if they align with the curriculum we teach and they're high in quality. We've got to play clever. We shouldn't be just doing bespoke content all the time just for the sake of it. That is ego, and it's the route to overload of workload. And I'm sure all of you are tired if you're teaching right now, as am I. We are encouraging our teachers, where they do need to record their own, to pre-record using a free product called Loom, rather than do live sessions. Although I'll be honest with you, live sessions we are now starting to use because our year 10 and year 12 are coming on site. So we're revisiting this now to sort of say, well, we may as well record what we're doing on site, and that therefore is live streamed because, well, that's kind of being forced on us. So let's merge the face-to-face contact with the remote teaching so it all sings together. In terms of assessment, we've asked our teachers to prioritize that they are assessing effectively. And we're trying to do that through tools like Google Quizzes and Google Assignments. And we're trying to do that at a class group level at the moment rather than individually, partly through workload, partly through a lack of evidence that written feedback really has much effect. It certainly has a lot of workload implications. We're encouraging our staff to use products that are out there that work for them if they have them to do that assessment. So for example, Caboodle and Seneca have a lot of built-in assessments. Let's use them. And we're leaving it down to subject teams as to the frequency of assessment because they know best. To help our teachers manage their workload, we're asking them to post the work at a whole year group level on a weekly basis, but the assessment occurs at a more granular level. And then the feedback we're giving at the moment is driven by those whole class formative assessment pieces. So in theory, there's no marking because you can just record your feedback like this. And finally, yeah, already discussed that. We're trying not to force teachers to use specific technologies as much as possible. We're trying to go with this idea that it's the quality of instruction, not the medium it's delivered through. So upskilling teachers so that there are a range of technologies they can use to get their teaching across and not being too prescriptive. Because what works in science, which is where Nikki and I work, as teachers may be very different to what works in English. And again, this is far too detailed to go through, but I guess we can share the slides with you afterwards via Kate. We've provided quite a lot of guidance for our staff on how we think we need teachers to be operating when it comes to remote delivery. And that's rather voluminous, so I'm not quite sure why I put that in there. But like I said, if we share the slides afterwards, or if you watch this recording, you can pause it on this screen. you may or may not find that guidance useful. There's lots of guidance. That's just a summary of tips we've developed. Okay, so just to summarize before we move on to the next rapid evidence assessment headline from the EEF about remote teaching. In our school, work is set weekly. We give staff a choice of medium to work through. And we are encouraging staff to do pre-recorded video explanations and feedback because we recognize students like that sense of connectedness, but we're not mandating it because all our teachers are in very different places in terms of home working, dependence at home, health, etc. Okay. And yes, as we move forwards, we're trying to blend the face-to-face on-site support with the remote teaching rather than one relegating the other or one duplicating the other. Okay, now I said that ensuring access to technology was key, particularly for the disadvantaged. What I want to do before handing over is just to signpost what's coming up next week with Andy and Mark Rowland. And Andy, when I've shut up for a second, if you want to introduce yourself, that would be cool. So we've got to be careful, as I said, technology does not become a barrier to all or some learners. And the stereotypical example is children without internet access and or ICT at home. Here are some obvious barriers that just occurred to me. And we're encountering this not just with the most disadvantaged economically. For example, in my own home, if my wife and I are both working at the same time and both my kids are trying to dial into Oak Academy for their primary education, things slow down a lot. And it means one working on a tablet, one working on a Chromebook, devices that aren't really designed for home learning. So, and that's in a classic middle class family. We're dealing with some people where they haven't even got an internet connection and they're trying to do it over 4G or whatever. So these kind of things are obvious, but we need to be really mindful of them when we're setting work, okay? And like I said, Mark and Andy will join you next week for the session, which you've hopefully already had advertised to you. And that's why Nikki and I are gonna stay away from this for today's session. Andy, did you wanna just introduce yourself before I hand over to Nikki?
Thanks, Roger. Yes, great to see everyone. Great to meet you. Mark and I will be with you next week. I'm really keen to share some of the pieces that are coming out of evidence from locally, nationally and regionally on this about supporting disadvantaged pupils. It's a real challenge, especially because disadvantage is changing, it's always evolving, and that which we're seeing now, and as Roger described there, those people who might not have considered themselves disadvantaged, some of them now are having significant disadvantage because of access in this way. So looking forward to it next week, and we'll basically make sure we strand out of today's one to next.
And in the meantime, if you go on Twitter, check out Mark's blogs, but also the recent podcast he did with Sandringham Research School, which would be excellent listening if you have the time before you get to meet him virtually in the flesh. Nikki, over to you.
Hi everyone, so thanks Roger. So I'm going to be talking about the recommendation in here. Just to also, I mean, Roger's already said this rapid evidence review does come with caveats, and you know we have to kind of say that before we start. The EEF at the moment are kind of looking at this in a bit more detail, but this was taken from what they had, you know, which was basically a lot of research around adult learning as well as kids that, you know, the age that we teach. And it was kind of older pupils, and some of you might be teaching younger pupils and so on. So, but the general principle that comes through, and it is, for me, this has been the most important message through all of this, that it's the quality of teaching, it's how you do it. It's not whether you're doing the live teaching with everybody kind of there with you. But one of the things, you know, the recommendation here, number 4, is that we have to support pupils to work independently. Well, it's not exactly rocket science, is it, in some ways? I mean, it's not like you wouldn't expect that to come out. But again, as Roger says, I think it's worth looking at this in more detail, because again, this isn't new, but the point is it isn't new. And so therefore there are some things that we can kind of look at to help us as we kind of struggle with this. And the first thing is that if you think of the experience that we have so far in this kind of thing, we've probably all set homework in the past. You know, homework is our previous experience of setting home learning. And yet, you know, this is a quote from Dylan William, which says that most homework teachers say is crap. Well, you know, and we've all, I mean, I'm certainly guilty of sometimes setting homework because I know I have to, because I know that parents will complain if I don't. And you know, it's a really important thing that we think about what we're setting and why. And that's when we see them in between. If you look at the, Roger, you're not muted and you're coughing.
Sorry, I thought I was.
If we look at the evidence that we had around homework already, this comes from the toolkit, the EEF's toolkit. And when they looked at primary homework, that actually the evidence is quite weak that it actually improves outcomes. Secondary, it's a little bit stronger, but what we do know is that it has to be set thoughtfully. It has to be set purposefully. It has to be set with, you know, with an end in mind. And so before we've even started, we knew that homework was tricky, and homework was something that we had to talk about. So, you know, this is a study here, a review that talks about what we have to think about. We have to make sure that it has a purpose, that it's meaningful, that students know why we're setting it. Efficiency shouldn't take up too much time. Ownership, you know, that our students actually feel like they should be doing it, that they're motivated to do it, that it belongs to them, I guess, in some ways. There's some point to it. And that they're able to do it, right? I mean, you know, we've all been set tasks where we feel that they're out of our range of anything that we can attempt to do, and we give up really before. I'm like that with maps. Someone gives me a map, I cannot read maps, and I just glaze over and I don't even try. You know, we have to make sure they've got the skills to be able to kind of attempt it in the first place. I love the one at the end, it's got to be inspiring. Okay, yeah, I'm not quite sure how much of my homework that I set is inspiring, but I understand the sentiment. And actually, you know, the point is that we're not just setting it for the sake of it. And that's with homework. That's with homework when we are seeing all of these students in between. We have a chance to talk to them. We have a chance to remind them why it's important to do it. We have a chance to kind of teach them the stuff. Here, we don't get that opportunity. And so all of those things are still there, but they're kind of heightened. And independence, one of the, if you read research about this, the thing that they talk about a lot is the ability for students to self-regulate their own learning. And that's such a big part of this independence. And I know that some of you were in the session that I did before. I think, oh God, it feels like years ago. I know you were, because I've seen John, who used to be my swimming coach for a while, and so he's in that group and he's here today. So I assume some of you have come across metacognition and self-regulation. Also, I know that Kate will have talked about it a lot as well. So for students to be independent learners, they need to have well-developed self-regulation. And just to remind you that this self-regulation term does encompass not just the cognition, not just the bits that we teach them, the knowledge that they need to do of how to do things, but the metacognition, which is being able to look at how they're learning, how they're understanding, how successful certain strategies were, and respond to that. You know, it's not just kind of reflecting, it's actually responding to that as well. But you know, at the moment for me, the most important one is this motivation. And motivation is something that often gets forgotten when we talk about self-regulation. We're quite good at thinking about metacognition, but motivation is a huge part of it, especially when we don't have that face-to-face contact with our students all the time. And so, you know, it's worth looking at the research behind metacognition. Just to remind you, there's a guidance report about it, and it has several recommendations. But the one that I'm really focusing on today, as I talk about what the EEF have done with kind of planning remote teaching is to look at this recommendation here. And one of the really key recommendations from the Metacognition and Self-Regulation Guidance report is that, first of all, metacognitive skills can be taught. They don't necessarily develop automatically or naturally over time. And not only can they be taught, but they should be taught. You know, that the most effective learners have very well developed self-regulation and metacognitive skills. And that means that we can take those skills that they have developed and actually explicitly teach them, kind of bottle them, distill them, and help those learners that don't do this already. And it's really important that we do in normal teaching, but I would say especially right now. And if you think about why that is, this is a slide that I've taken from Kingsbridge Research School, which and I'll point you towards a webinar they did that you can see. But they've just kind of pointed out some of the things that we do in class without even realizing we do it. You know, if you've got 30 kids in front of you, without even noticing that you're doing it, because it comes so automatically after a while, you will be taking in the body language, for example. I'll tell you, one of the most freaky things about doing this at the moment is I can't see anyone. And so you can't pick up on those kind of non-verbal signals. You might all be asleep for all I know, you know, and whereas when we're kind of, usually when we have people in front of us, it's those little kind of hints, those eyebrow raises, those kind of people switching off, looking out the window, looking scared about things. And you will be kind of thinking, oh yeah, no, I need to go and just check if he needs me to go and help him with that, or I just need to come back to that because they look like they're struggling. Now, we can't do that. We can't do that with remote learning. So not only is metacognition and self-regulation important in normal life, but it's especially important when we don't have those kids in front of us to do those things that we do quite naturally and almost do the scaffolding for them. We can't scaffold for them anymore when they're not in front of us. So we know that we need to support pupils to work independently, and this will help them. And I'm just going to leave you just to read what's in the screen now. So there's a few things here, you know, that this has come out of the review that they did on remote learning, that it is important to teach those strategies that pupils need to work independently. And they are things that we can kind of distill and we can teach explicitly. And this is going to be especially important for those pupils that are particularly disadvantaged. I mean, you know, in a normal situation, and you will know if you have been teaching remotely at the moment, there are kids that will be getting on with this and flying at the moment. You know, there are some kids that are sat at home, they have the facilities, they have the time, the space, the support, or the self-regulation skills that are already well developed, and they will be flying with remote learning, and that is fantastic. And you know, we also need to support them, but there will be some that are finding it much more difficult, and they are the ones that we really need to think about in this context. And I say, I've taken some of these slides from Kingsbridge Research School, who did a webinar on metacognition and home learning. It's on YouTube, so Google it if you want to look for it. I found it really, really helpful. And like I say, I've nicked some of the slides directly from them. But this was about basically a planning framework that the EEF produced in response to the situation we're in at the moment. And the planning framework was really planned to answer the question, you know, how can we adjust our practice to help students learn remotely? That's the kind of question, that's the puzzle that they were trying to solve, the issue they were trying to solve. So what I will very briefly talk about, and it will be brief over the next 10 minutes or so, is where the advice comes from that they've put together. what we mean by metacognitive strategies, we've talked a little bit about that, why they're particularly important now, again, we've already kind of touched on that, and then look at this planning framework, and probably most importantly for us at the moment when we're thinking about how we do this is what it might look like in practice. Now this planning framework is available online. If you go to the EEF website or just Google EEF COVID-19 resources, there are some resources that have been specifically put together to support schools at the moment. And one of those resources is this planning framework. And the idea of this is it's tried to take the recommendations from the Metacognition guidance report and how lessons and learning sequences should be planned to help to teach and to develop and support the metacognitive strategies in our pupils. How, you know, that guidance report was written for a usual normal face-to-face classroom situation, and how can we try to translate that to the situation we have at the moment. So if you look online, there's this one here, which is basically explains what the framework is. And actually what I think it's worth looking at here is, so I was part of the team that put this together, and we were very explicit about the fact that we wanted offline as well as online examples. For the reasons that Roger said, you know, there will be kids that are quite able to access this stuff, and there will be others that aren't. So, you know, really wanted to think about the offline as well as online. And so there's this one that kind of tells you how it works. There's a blank version if you want to put it together, and there's some worked examples there as well that we'll kind of look at in a minute. What I would say about this is if you are thinking about metacognition and this kind of learning sequence in normal times, this is never something that was ever expected to take place in one single lesson. And I think that's the big mistake people make sometimes when they look at the metacognition guidance report. It talks about activating learning and practicing and reviewing and all these things that are really, really important. Even the, you know, the monitoring and evaluation, planning, monitoring, evaluation cycle, the more simple one. There are, the big mistake I think that people make is to think they have to do that within their 50-minute lesson or their hour lesson, because you can't. And you know, learning doesn't happen like that. Learning doesn't neatly fall into a 1-hour slot. But if, for example, I'm thinking, okay, so at the moment, over the next few weeks, I'm going to be teaching about the periodic table, and I want to make sure, first of all, my pupils remember what the periodic table is and what it represents and how it's put together and why it's put together in the way it is. And really what I want to get to by the end of, you know, this sequence of learning is I want them to be able to link that to the structure of the atom, and I want them to be able to make certain predictions from it. That's probably a couple of weeks learning. That's probably 3, 4, maybe 5 lessons, especially if I really spend a lot of time kind of practicing things and making sure they know it. Now, within that sequence of learning, I want to remind them what they know about the periodic table. I want to do various things where they practice different skills, and I want to come back and review it at the end. And, you know, there'll be so much involved in that. Over that course of time, I will be following that metacognitive sequence, but it won't be within a 1-hour slot. And I'm just saying that because this planning framework here is not supposed to be for one session. But within a sequence of learning, however many sessions that is, however that looks in your particular kind of context, the research, you know, the guidance suggests that we should be thinking about activating prior knowledge, explaining strategies, practicing them, reflecting on them, and then reviewing them. And there's one thing to make clear here. When we're talking about explaining here, this is about strategies. This is not just kind of delivering content, I guess you might call it. This is the how you do things. And it's really important. That's where the time goes, because that's the bit that we're not there to help with, right? I mean, the knowledge itself, the bits and pieces can be, you know, given to people quite easily. It's something they can read, but explaining the strategies, that's harder to do. So activating prior knowledge, as Roger said at the beginning, you know, it's really important that knowledge builds on prior learning, that you remind them of what they've done previously that's connected to what they're going to do today. And, you know, there's so many different ways you can do that. It might be, you know, a quiz or just showing them a video. The best analogy someone showed me of this, I don't know if I said it when I spoke to you before, is they were saying that when they watch TV shows, there's those, they always do the catch up at the start of the TV show from the previous episodes, because however big a fan you are, however much you've talked about it over the week, you still want that little bit of a reminder. So that's, you know, that's got to be part of the sequence somewhere. Explaining, again, this is strategies, right? This isn't, you know, just telling people stuff. This is those thinking, why it is that you make the decisions you do? Why is it that you choose to do this at a certain point? Those things that you know as a teacher, because you've done it lots of times, but you're introducing for the first time. You know, so for example, in maths, you could just show people how to solve an equation or give them instructions, or you could talk people through it. You could elaborate on the steps you take, or you can show a worked example. You know, this one here has two very similar examples here. It shows you how to do it on one side, and then on the other side people are taking it through. So it's just, so the emphasis here is on the strategy, not on the actual kind of this is an equation or whatever. So we've got activate, where we're recapping things. We've got explaining, where we're demonstrating. And for me, this is, if you're going to do your recording, if you are doing any kind of recording at all, this is where the emphasis should be. This is the bit where they need a teacher's explanation. And if you can't record it, you know, this is where elaborating on worked examples, for example, going back to the previous one, you can just write the notes in. This is why I made the decisions that I did at this particular time. That's the expertise that you have as a teacher. That's the nub of what we're doing, and that's the most difficult thing to do remotely. So that, I think, is where a lot of the emphasis has to be, because then after that, well, the practice, you know, there's lots of ways that you can introduce practice. Here I would say scaffolding is really, really important. It's not just a question of giving lots and lots of examples. Think about how those examples are going to look. How much scaffolding are you going to give at the beginning? You know, probably the first few questions that people try, you will give lots and lots of prompts. Get them to use those knowledge organizers, you know, those essay plans that they have, all of those kind of structures that you have in place normally to help them do what they're going to do, and then encourage them to gradually remove that as you go through. And the practice, I think, you know, we probably said in the session before, that's the bit that is so easy to skip over in normal lessons. But we really need to make sure we put enough of this in. And the reflection, you know, reflection is going to be really important here, especially, you know, those most effective learners, they are the ones that will do this without thinking, really. So there has to be some kind of prompt to help the kids that don't do this automatically and it can just be just putting a question at the end of a, you know, I used to quite often on Google Form homeworks I'd just put a question at the end saying, how did you find this, or which question did you find most difficult, or why do you think you got one of those questions wrong? You know, just those little prompts to get people to think about what they've done and how they'll do something differently. And the review, in some ways, this is going to be the easiest part, as long as we know that we should, you know, that we should be planning it in. There's so many ways of reviewing things, but if we're doing this for a long period of time, you just need to make sure you come back to it at one point. I'm just keeping an eye on the time, but it's worth just showing you a couple of examples that they gave with the King's Bridge. And the point that they made, and I think this is a really good point, that often when they're in the classroom, actually a lot of the emphasis of their time and their effort goes on the actual content, because they know that they're there to physically kind of scaffold things in person if they need to be. But they've kind of flipped it around. They were saying for this, they really think it's going to be a question of, you know, maybe reducing the subject content for a while that you think you would cover in a certain period of time, because actually those strategies around them are going to be so much more important. And in normal life, we skip over these quite easily. In this situation, we really need to make sure that we have that in there. And the example he gave was when he was teaching a poem, you know, he might go through each of these 5 poems in 2 lessons and kind of goes for one and then the next and so on. But in this situation, maybe the thing to do is to do 1 poem and then have a couple of sessions where you're actually practicing and consolidating, because this process is going to be so, you know, important as we go on. We're not there to pick up the pieces for them if things fall, and so sometimes that has to be planned in. And so, you know, this was an example around English and poems, and there was the activation of actually thinking about how we approach them. They'd actually swapped this round next to thinking about, you know, the annotating about why you do things, you know, what the point of all this was, and then going through the process and the worked examples and so on. If you look on the EEF website, there's a few worked examples as well. There's one from English literature, there's a maths one there, chemistry, German. And actually I did this recently with some of the teachers from Norwich and Norfolk that we were talking about metacognition, and these are some of the examples they gave of how they've been kind of setting remote work. And there's a few things that I thought it was really good to kind of draw your attention to. So in this first one here, I think it's really clear that we've got kind of a topic that's going on over a few lessons, but where the emphasis of the recording, the Loom presentation, that's the explanation. They haven't just gone, I'm going to record a lesson where we're going to, it's not, it's about breaking that lesson up into different parts and the Loom being used for specific things. I liked this one as well because that, you know, they've recognised that there is a point in having that teacher's voice there, but they've thought really carefully about where that teacher's voice comes in, and it's not just constant and all the time. This one here I really liked because they were talking about the how important it is to break down things into smaller tasks, and this one here again, it's the modeling how to approach tasks as well as the tasks themselves, where the focus was. So it's just a few examples of how people have done this, but the framework is there, and as much as anything, it's a thinking framework, kind of a checklist. You know, have I put all of these aspects into my remote learning sequence as I kind of, whatever time period I do this over? Have I made sure there's a chance for people to reflect on what they've done before? Have I made sure that they've thought about it afterwards? Have I reviewed it with them? Have I come back to it? And so on. But it's over the course of some time. So I'll hand over to Roger now just to finish. You're muted, Roger.
For a second, I was just saying thank you, Nikki. Both Nikki and I have primary age children who are sort of in and out of school at the moment. So Nikki's got to go at 2 on the dot, which is part of the reason why she's handing back to me. So if you see her drop out of the Zoom, that is why. All right, we've struggled, in case you haven't noticed, to make this session particularly interactive. Perhaps we could have thought about that more carefully. In the 10 minutes we've got left, I wondered if we could try this, please. I would like each of you listening to reflect. What one thing might you share with staff at your school, if indeed anything, from what Nikki and I have had to say? 2, which 2 people are you going to speak to as a result of today's session? If the conclusion is no one, it was a rubbish session, well, fine. And 3, what 3 ideas or insights have proved memorable from today's training? Now, here's a challenge. I don't know if it's going to work or not, but you've all got access to the chat feature. If you would like to post your reflection in that format into chat, then we can all see it, which would be interesting. And Kate is recording this session, which means she can share the chat transcript afterwards. So I just invite you to take the opportunity to try that, please. So it would be 3 short sentences or barely sentences, numbered 1, 2, and 3. I'll leave that on the screen so you can see it, and I'm going to start watching the chat window just to see if anyone bites, because I'm very curious.
So Roger, I'm going to muscle in and not do it on the chat, but to say it,
Okay.
you won't be surprised to know that. But no, I think the thing that's really stayed with me is that reassurance to trainees and to early career teachers about it's the quality of the teaching rather than actually the vehicle that is used. And I think that's really key for them to understand, and I think is going to be really reassuring. And also, that structure that Niki just went through, about the activate, explain, practice, reflect, review. They know that from all the stuff they've done with Rosenshine, but actually to see it applied to remote learning, I think is really good. So I'm just going to shut up now because I see there's loads of chat. All right, thank you.
Cool. Well, I'm not seeing anything on chat, so perhaps that's not something that people want to have a go at.
I can see it, Roger. I can see it. Do you want me to?
Yeah, I don't know why I can't. So go on, Niki, read out a few.
You're not everyone by the looks of things. So there's people talking about the scaffolding, where they're going to use the recorded lessons and where they're not. The EEF planning framework, people are saying they want to go and have a look at that. They're talking about who they're going to share it with. And yeah, that somebody talking about motivation here. That's a good one, actually. That's a good, someone said less subject and more strategy. I think that's a really nice summary there of the activate, explain, etc. Was explained as like the way it was explained as a previous episode of a TV show. That was a light bulb moment for me as well when someone said that to me, and I've used it ever since. Less focus on content, more on strategies and metacognition. It's such a hard thing to do, and I would say, I was thinking about this beforehand, because it's such a temptation to think that we want to cover more, we've run out, we've missed so much teaching, we want to make up lost time. But all I'd say is there's a difference, and you know this deep down, but there's a difference between covering more and actually learning more. That we all know the difference between actually seeing something and properly taking it in. And when things get really hard, for me, that's the thing that I have to keep in the back of my head. I'll hand back to Roger now.
Well, to be honest, Niki, like even when I've got my normal year's worth of teaching hours with a group, I can't avoid that dilemma. Do I whiz through the whole spec like some sort of tick list, or do I go as far with the content in a deep way as I can, being careful to use my subject knowledge to know what is fundamental to the course and what can be signposted? So it's the old phrase, isn't it? Teach what you have time to teach well. And unfortunately, if you're in denial about that in your normal classroom practice, this is going to force us to, or we're just going to overload the kids with 7 slideshows a week. Let's just carry on regardless. Okay, I don't know why I can't see the chat window, but we can now take it a slightly different way. Would anyone like to unmute if they have any questions they wish to ask? Tumbleweed.
Roger, it's probably easier if you unshare your screen and then we can see everyone. There we go.
Yeah, people can also do the raise hand trick.
Yes, they know how to do that.
Yeah, so let's
see if anybody.
Oh, now I can suddenly see the Zoom chat. My computer's obviously freezing up. Right.
So you could probably, while they're thinking of some questions, you could probably have a look at some of that.
Yeah. Well, it's just good to see what people are thinking of in terms of the most pertinent points they've taken. It's nice to see people have said that there's anything in the talk they find useful, because we were really worried about overloading them. So that's, if nothing else, reassuring for me and Niki. Right, I haven't seen a hand go up yet.
No, there doesn't seem to be.
That's okay. Just give it a chance.
Yeah, I think that idea.
Oh, hang on. Is that Dan? No, Dan. Go on, Dan. You don't have to wait to unmute. You can just speak. Go for it.
Okay. Yeah, I had a question. So sorry, my computer crashed a little bit, so I did miss a little bit. So you might have already covered this question, but our school at Stowmarket High is we're setting one task per week for the duration of 1 hour. There are quite a number of sort of stages as such, with the activate, explain, model, practice, reflection, review, and so on. How do you think is it practically possible to fit all of those in when you can only set one piece of work per week?
No, not in one session, no. So I would say, for example, so this is a really good example where you have to think about what it is you're trying to get across in that hour you have a week, and you're probably going to have to cut down what you would, and it's horrible, but you know, so for example, you know, going back to that periodic table thing I was talking about, that there'll be some things that I know I can get them to read, and the explanation and so on is less important, but I will still remind them at the start what the periodic table is, and that might just be 2 minutes at the start of whatever I do, getting them to write down, you know, everything they remember about the periodic table, where the metals and non-metals are, or something like that. Sorry, Tom, I'll be there in a sec. Sorry, that's my son. To the front of the house. Sorry. We're walking our neighbour's dog at 2. So I think it as much as anything. So, but if there is something within that where the explanation is really, really important, then that might be a good 20-25 minutes of that hour session. And then, you know, the practice might go on to the next week. So the next hour might be reminding them what they've done in the hour before, and then going straight into the practice. And then the review would certainly be further down the line, and it might cut. So no, certainly not in 1 hour. And I know I've heard a lot of schools doing this for very good reasons. So the prioritizing that we do as teachers anyway, where we think about what it is we're going to fit into a lesson, becomes so much more acute. But
can I chip in?
Yeah, the learning sequence, however you do it, is important, but
Dan,
just over the course of
I would say, if you're not activating prior knowledge, you've got real trouble, because they're not going to be able to cohere the new information you convey with their existing prior knowledge if you're not attempting to activate it. But one of the traps I fell in with my own practice early on, as I started to understand cognitive load theory and the potential power of retrieval practice, was all of a sudden my lessons became dominated by retrieval quizzes and elongated activation of prior knowledge, just like whatever happens when we try doing something new. Sometimes activating prior knowledge can be as simple as one question or 2 relevant questions. You don't have to start every blinking lesson with a 15-question retrieval quiz. That
or
could
just
be
reminding them.
Yeah, or just
reminding them
telling
of 3 really important keywords. You know, do you remember the keywords that we use? You know, elements, atoms, metals, non-metals. You know, remember what they mean before. So it can be really simple. I'm really sorry, I've got to go, but thank you,
cheers,
everybody.
Yeah, but just building on that, we risk, even more than normal, pupils' learning becoming atomized and not sticking in long-term memory when we deliver remotely. So I wouldn't skimp on activating prior knowledge. I just think about how I can do that efficiently. So how can I flick a switch? I don't have to turn all the lights on in the house necessarily if I'm really stumped for time. Okay. Right, I'm conscious of time. Having said that, can I just invite people to, where are we? To check out the EEF website for what is a plethora of resources, in particular the COVID specific resources. But just to recap, these are the guidance reports and evidence summaries we were talking about today. I didn't even get on to working with parents to support children's learning, but that's another really useful one, the difference between how we support parents with their children's learning and how different it is at primary to secondary. At secondary, it's about not expecting parents to be experts in every subject, but about helping the parents to scaffold that self-regulation, giving parents signposts to know what the kids should be doing in terms of activity completion and self-reflection, and helping the students with their motivation and adherence to that. We've not even mentioned parents, which is potentially an oversight, but that guidance report's particularly useful so that we give appropriate support to parents for secondary versus primary phase. And just to go back to what we had at the start, if you want to connect with us, there are our Twitter handles again. I see already a couple of people have started following us, which is cool. And final thought, which Susie's going to kill me for, but Research Ed Norwich is this Saturday. She's laughing. Research Ed Norwich would have been in Norwich this Saturday at City Academy Norwich, but obviously it can't be. So that's now a completely free event this Saturday and Sunday, like amazing array of speakers nationally and regionally. And they'll all be completely free to access on YouTube, but you have to go to our website and register so that we know who's accessing them. Just a stunning array of people. I'm gobsmacked, and over 1,500 sign-ups to participate, which is stressing Susie out a bit, but Susie's doing fabulously.
I'm very, very scared.
So there's a whole strand on Saturday and Sunday about remote teaching, but then you've got the great and the good like Alex Quigley and all sorts of people coming in talking about other aspects of evidence-informed practice as well. So if you can spare some time, get yourself a ticket. You'll be able to watch the videos pretty much all of Saturday and Sunday, and then they'll go offline again for a while before we probably publish them at a later date. All right.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. The advert for the research for your research school, you know, is at the weekend has gone round all the trainees.
Oh, fabulous! Thank you.
So that's been on their emails for a couple of weeks. Do you know what I mean? So they knew all about that. But yeah, but thank you so much. Thank you so much for today. Thank you. Oh, he's disappeared. There he is.
No, I'm here. Sorry.
So thank you very much. Thank you to you and for Nikki, and also for Susie helping put this together. Just really appreciate your time. And like I said, I think, as I said to Nikki, the fact that that point about the fact that it's the quality of teaching rather than them all get worried about whether or not they're using Google Classroom or the next best thing, I think is just really key for these sort of inexperienced teachers to feel comfortable about that. So I think that's a really strong message, and I really
the medium is not the message. Yeah,
really.
Yeah.
I think that's really strong, and I think really, I mean, based on evidence, I think it's really reassuring. So thank you so much.
Stuff.
Really appreciate it. Great. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. We'll look forward to seeing Andy next week. So that'll be really good. So thanks, Andy. That'll be great. And yeah, so I'll bring this session to a close. But if some of the NQTs can perhaps stay online and talk to me, that would be great. And I'll stop the recording now, Roger, so that we've got that. But you'll see in the chat there, they're all saying thank you to you as well.
Stellar, thanks. Yeah, if it has worked, Kate, I really appreciate it if you could share the recording in the chat.
Yeah, of course. Thanks very much. Take care. Thanks, Roger. Thanks, Susie.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye-bye.